The newsday continues here on One News Now Business. I'm Jaco Castro. Here are the biggest stories on the economic and corporate fronts. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development expects the Philippine economy to expand by 5.7% in 2023. That's below the government's 6 to 7% target for this year and slower than the 7.6% economic growth recorded in 2022. The OECD said exports may slow this year due to global economic slowdown and tighter monetary conditions amid elevated inflation. Still, the Philippines has the second highest growth forecast among ASEAN countries, behind only Vietnam's 6.4%. For 2024, the OECD gave the Philippines a 6.1% projection, which is also below the government's 6.5 to 8% target. Analysts see inflation likely further easing in April. That's according to a poll by Business World poll. Business World reports that its poll of 14 analysts yielded a median estimate of 7% for April inflation. If realized, it would be slower than the 7.6% inflation logged in March. It will also settle near the upper end of the Bangko Central's forecast range of 6.3 to 7.1% for the month of April. Analysts attribute the lower projection to lower food prices, cuts in electricity rates and LPG prices, as well as favorable base effects. However, still elevated inflation may prompt the central bank to raise rates anew at its policy meeting later this month. This despite earlier signals of a pause. There is no better partner to have than the Philippines. That's what U.S. President Joe Biden told his Filipino counterpart, President Bongbong Marcos, as Biden welcomed Marcos to the White House. Biden reaffirmed America's ironclad commitment to defend the Philippines, including in the South China Sea. The U.S. President tells Marcos that he agrees with the Philippine President's previous statement that the strong alliance between the two nations must evolve. For his part, President Marcos said that the relationship is essential, especially as the Philippines faces rising tensions with China at the South China Sea.
The United States also remains ironclad in our commitment to the defense of the Philippines, including the South China Sea, and we're going to continue to support the Philippines' military modernization.
Beyond that, there are also the geopolitical issues that have made the region where the Philippines is possibly, arguably, the most complicated geopolitical situation in the world right now.
Biden also vowed to deepen economic cooperation between the two countries. In line with that, the U.S. President says he will be sending a first-of-its-kind presidential trade and investment mission to the Philippines.
And together, we're tackling climate change, we're accelerating our country's transition to clean energy, and we're standing up for our shared democratic values and workers' rights and the rule of law. And together, we're deepening our economic cooperation, which is going to continue to deepen. I think is mutually beneficial.
Now, aside from President Biden, Marcos also met with some business leaders, including officials of U.S.-based nuclear energy firm NuScale Power Corporation. The firm expressed interest to invest in the Philippines by providing additional power supply. Marcos, who currently sits as the Philippines Agriculture Chief, also held a meeting earlier with U.S. Department of Agriculture head Thomas Vilsack. The two agreed to establish a ministerial team to further cooperations in the agriculture sector. Though it was a productive day for Marcos, his visit to the U.S. has been marred by protests. Demonstrators say the Philippine president is not welcome in Washington. We'll be back with more stories after the break. Keep it here on One News. You're still watching One News Now. I'm Diego Castro. Philippine Airlines announces adjustments to the schedule of some flights on May 2 and 3. The flag carrier said at least 15 international flights and 7 domestic flights are affected. Most of these flights may be delayed by 30 minutes to more than 3 hours. PAL explained that the adjustments will give way to the government's radar system maintenance works. Passengers are advised to contact the airline for available options. Meanwhile, authorities are now probing the power outage at the NAIA Terminal 3 on Monday. Manila International Airport Authority Assistant General Manager Brian Ko told The Big Story that initial investigation pointed to an electrical fault in the airport system. Ko noted, however, that they are not ruling out other possible angles, including sabotage.
We're looking at all angles. It's not just the issue of the equipment, the maintenance. We are also tapping the expertise of the NICA and the other law enforcement agencies because they find it that there's some sort of a pattern. Why would it happen always on a holiday?
Meralco immediately responded and was able to restore power at NAIA 3 around 6 hours after the outage. Transportation Chief Jaime Bautista said they plan to conduct a full electrical audit for all NAIA terminals.
Hindi natin dinidiscount din yan, no? Meralco will also siguro help us assess kung talagang merong sabotage or not. Medyo malaking trabaho tong rehabilitation ng Terminal 3. So may yung full audit niyan, we really need to do a procurement, no? Kasi malaking trabaho yan no. Kanina pinag-uusapan namin with Meralco, no, and sabi nila it may take 60 to 90 days, no, to do a full electrical audit.
Smart Communications says it plans to subsidize the 4G transition for subscribers who still use 3G handsets. In a report by the Philippine Star, Smart says it will offer several options for customers who will be affected by the closure of 3G services next year. This includes subsidizing a port of the cost for upgrading to 4G phones, especially in areas that are used to connecting to a 3G network. This in line with the mobile giant's plans to accelerate the shutdown of legacy assets this year. Smart says 8% or about 5.3 million of its subscribers remain connected to 3G services, even as majority of the country has transitioned to 4G, LTE, and 5G. Is the U.S. Federal Reserve's fight against inflation nearing its end? Majority of investors expect a pivot from the Fed. The full story courtesy of Bloomberg.
Is the Fed done hiking interest rates? We're seeing some signs of U.S. economic slowdown, from an increase in jobless claims to reduced consumer spending. Add to that a potential credit crunch caused by that banking turmoil in March, and you may have a recipe for interest rate cuts by the Federal Reserve next year. At least that's what the majority of investors expect, according to the latest Bloomberg survey of professional and retail investors. Some 85% of respondents expect the central bank to eventually cut its benchmark rate to 3% or below. And that's potentially lower than rates currently implied by market pricing. But we've got some time to kill here. More than half of respondents say that those cuts won't take place until the first half of 2024 at the earliest. A rate hike in May would push the benchmark rate above 5%. And consensus is building around the idea that policymakers will then pause and they'll assess the impact of their tightening cycle and eventually start unwinding some of those rate hikes once it's clear that inflation has calmed down. With every new economic data point comes a new hot take about the fight against inflation. But ultimately, what the Fed's going to do depends on what big picture emerges from all of the different data points. And markets don't always agree with the Fed. Jay Powell has pledged that the central bank won't stop hiking inflation until it gets down to its 2% target. Economists expect CPI to stay at that level through the end of this year and to hover above 2% into 2024 and 2025. But the recipe for the Fed and markets could be rendered unusable due to one big elephant in the room, and that's the U.S. debt ceiling. Any showdown on that could throw off all predictions for the Fed's path ahead.
And those are the top business stories of the hour. I'm Diego Castro. Join us again at 2 p.m. We are One News. All sides, all the time.